Hello everyone, I'm Andrew King from the University of Greenwich, and you can see in front of you what this paper is about. Welcome to Panel 25, Queering the Victorians. First of all, I want to thank my other members of Panel 25 on Queering the Victorians. It's absolutely wonderful to be on a panel with Molly and Angela. I'm sure we'll have a great conversation when we come to the live part. Now, what I'm doing here is a bit different. First of all, I'm not necessarily talking about a strictly Victorian time period. We'll come to that later. But first of all, I think I need to define one of our core terms here, which is, of course, queer. Now, I find this definition that you can see in front of you from the introduction to the recent Cambridge Companion to Queer Studies quite helpful. It's got two parts. This is a definition, the part in red, that would be familiar to all of us. To use other words, I'm not going to read out the screen that you yourselves can read, to use other words borrowed from Grog and Erin in the chronology of the Cambridge Companion, the queer of queer studies often means thinking and acting in ways that are positioned as non-normative. That means that the queer must necessarily exist outside non-regulatory institutions, that it escapes the various kinds of regulatory discipline. As the reclaiming of a once derogatory term, it's associated with the carnivalesque non-normative, the carnivalesque celebration of the non-normative, so famously embodied in RuPaul's Drag Race. But it's the second part of the definition from Siobhan Somerville's introduction that I'm keen to explore here. Queer as a verb that's interested in how normativity and non-normativity are produced. But before we go any further, though, I want to ask a question that I hope will provoke happy discussion. Are queer approaches now institutionalized? For it seems to me that the very publication of a Cambridge Companion, just one of very many well-reviewed, very respectable queer handbooks and guides, suggests that it is. That means, of course, that the first part of the definition cannot stand. For if institutionalized, then the queer is subject to institutional discipline and control. And my deepest question in this paper stems from this query, this troubled query. For if the queer has been incorporated into the institution of academia, how far back might an institutionalized queer go in other domains of practice and knowledge? And what are the implications of that institutionalized queer? In the theatre, of course, the answer is forever. One thinks of ancient Greek male actors playing women, the 18th century burlesque tradition of cross-dressed performance. One of my PhD students is awaiting a viva on actresses who played Macheath in the Beggar's Opera, for example. There's the Victorian tradition that we know very well from Tipping the Velvet of travesty, but we've neither time nor interest in that here. We know it all. As I said, my focus is on an Edwardian time period, and particularly on a magazine called The Wizard, which is concerned with the work of stage illusionists. And what caught my eye was this description in the one issue that I have on the BLT 19 site from The Wizard. It's a bit small, isn't it? But the context is interesting. Note the men-only profession of magicians. This is less Harry Potter than Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norris. Here's the relevant passage blown up. Now, what struck me first as queer was the parade of embarrassment at the gender confusion of the Oriental magician. He's often embarrassed by being mistaken for a woman. This isn't the complex emotion of shame as defined by many writers like Kay Mitchell for the last 30 years or so, that emotion of self-assessment, a peculiarly social experience which depends on the perceived assessments of oneself by others. It isn't shame work or working through, but if anything, it's what some queer theorists call a work with the Q, an identity which is artifacted, blatantly artificial, precisely not an uncontrolled shame, but a camp construction and parade of shame, an ironic game of claims that everyone knows to be false, but which is insisted on as true. Now, significantly, Jawad Hetep, the magician here, he's the only magician in this series who's not assigned a portrait photograph, but it's a kind of imitation woodblock print. The print shows a figure with 3 tasseled umbrellas in long skirts, wide pleated sleeves, and perhaps a pharaonic hat. I confess I find it hard to make out any details, even blown up, though it's true that from the clothes here, from 1906, for this is when this magazine was published, the figure is certainly gender ambiguous. In this poster, though, Jawad Hetep, called here the Wizard of the Sphinx, is male and black, or is that blackface? That too is highly artifacted work, for Jawad Hetep was neither black nor Egyptian. He was born Percy Thomas Tibbles, who was active on the stage as an illusionist from around 1898 to the 1930s. And from the 1920s onwards, he was involved in the gambling industry, including advertising and getting involved school-aged children in the gambling industry. Tibbles had 2 stage names: the British gentleman Selbit, Tibbles backwards with the central B removed, and the name by which he's usually remembered now, the British gentleman, and the Wizard of the Sphinx, Jawad Hetep, a sexually ambiguous figure, as we've seen, sometimes, as Selbit's own periodical tells us, mistaken for a woman. The 2 personae sometimes shared the same billing, as you can see in this advert here from the Torquay Times from the 13th of March 1908. And they had complementary but related functions in the entertainment industry. Selbit's magic tricks often formed a mock violence on women. He's most famous for having invented the trick of sawing women in half. This image is from the Worthing Gazette. But dressed as a European capitalist, as Selbit, Tibbles performed on the stage the magic of capital, as Francesca Coppa has sagely pointed out in her rather wonderful book. And this included various disappearing and reappearing coin tricks. Ultimately, Tibbles as Selbit apologizes for capital and misogyny by showing that all the problems with capital and misogyny are imaginary. Jawad Hetep, by contrast, presents an older tradition of magic coming from an elsewhere. In a black wig and dark makeup, Tibbles as Jawad Hetep, dressed after the, I quote the wizard, the quaint old world appearance of his ancestors who wore skirts and their hair long. Jawad Hetep's tricks involved domestic items associated with the feminine, as you see the umbrellas, but he was also famous for his Egyptian bricks, which seem to teleport across space. All this is lots of fun. It flaunts sexual ambiguity, but in fact, the figure of Jawad Hetep is a mocking apologist for extractionist imperialism and the consumption of colonial imports. Unlike Selbit, Jawed Heteb disappears by 1910. We assume, or I assume, that the social anxieties about imperialism he was addressing either dissipating or becoming too great to be dealt with in this particular manner. Now that's all very well, but if you've read the abstract I sent for the conference, you'll know that I'm fundamentally concerned with how Tibbles manipulated the very material medium of print to forward and enable his queer illusions. Now, I discovered Tibbles' Selbit Jawed Heteb by chance. I was working on BLT 19, which is a deliberately poor open access project devoted to histories of, to stories and fictions concerning work in its many senses. That's with the Q as well as labour and all sorts of other senses. And I'm particularly focused on 19th century trade and professional periodicals. And I've digitized and put up 11 periodicals, or I should say those parts of them that I've been able to find. And unlike lots of sites, I've been very careful to contextualize those digitizations with essays about how to read the periodicals, and indeed how to read the digital forms of the periodicals themselves, which are of course very different from paper copies. There are a lot more samples of periodicals in the offing. It's just a matter of finding the time, not just to digitize these periodicals, but to research them. For at times, no library or archives we can find, certainly not the British Library, has paper copies, let alone digital ones. This is the case with the Swan Lane Gazette. I can find no trace of any copy elsewhere at all, though there are a couple of references to it in contemporary periodicals. Another that appears in no research library, though it's very well known in accounts of the history of stage magic, is, yes, The Wizard. As I say, I'm cheating a bit in discussing The Wizard because it's not 19th century or even Victorian, really, 1906, this issue comes from. And it isn't fiction in the usual sense of imagined narratives about characters. But I was working on it at the time the abstracts were due, and anyway, who can resist? A magazine for conjurers, concert artists, and all entertainers. We're all subject to the fascination of illusion, of identity work. For of course, such publications deal with fiction, with illusion and narratives about the creation of illusion, and about practitioners, writers of those illusory narratives. Fiction is therefore, to my mind, and this is my argument and I'm sticking to it, at the core of The Wizard. I should also tell you, perhaps, before you rush off to the British Library catalogue to check if my claim that this monthly journal doesn't exist there is true or not, that the British Library does have a magazine of the same title covering the same ground, but it's a bit different. It's a shilling revival of the original one. The shilling revival began in 1947. Here's the front cover of the first issue with a picture of Jasper Maskelyne, the son of the Maskelyne whose Egyptian hall is so famous in the history of magic. In the role, Jasper's dressed in the role of a Chinese magician. I think you can see already after my two examples how extremely problematic the illusions and fictions in this paper are, indeed how deeply interwoven the history of stage magic, racism, gender anxiety and gender ambiguity, and imperialism are. This is a dense and heavy cloth that no amount of illusion and sleight of hand ambiguity or queer reading caused by ingenious cutting or sewing should seek to lighten or make glitter or be celebrated in my mind. Here, that the image, like the one of Jawed Heteb, seems queerly to mix media ingeniously so as to leave us uncertain. I mean, is this image a woodblock, a photograph, both, something else? This ambiguity should not distract us from its ethical implications. And that's the central point of this paper. Queer ambiguity, including gender and sexuality slippage and sliding that's so often regarded as characteristic and subversive in queer studies, might well not be subversive at all. It might work well for many, it might advantage or amuse very large social groups, but it can just as well be profoundly oppressive to others. Mine then is a cautioning intervention that asks us to look at wider contexts. To get back to The Wizard. The Wizard was founded as a sixpenny monthly, 16-page illustrated octavo in September 1905 by Tibbles, and here he is again. It was Selbit, the name Selbit, under which he conducted the Wizard, though. And here you can see a version of him with moustache and goatee flying through the clouds like a Superman in a fool's outfit, bearing a flaming torch which acts as a mast of a pennon bearing the journal title. Very amusing, I'm sure you'll agree. And as we know, revenue from advertising was often the real reason for starting up a magazine. That's probably going to upset an awful lot of people here at the conference, but I really do think this is true. The content, whether scissors and paste from other parts of the publication, for example, or specially written content such as the practical tips, this is all merely the bait. As we know now, I think, we consumers are actually the product sold when we consume media text. And this was the case in the 19th century as well. And the issue of the Wizard we have on BLT 19 does have adverts, but not really very many. The relatively high cover price must have been a substantial contribution to the financial financing of the magazine. On the other hand, the magazine itself seems to function as a giant advert for Selbit himself. The most obvious way that we can see this is how the central 4 pages, and there's just one here, comprise one giant advert for Selbit's book, The Magical Entertainer. Selbit was heavily involved in the media industry as well as the stage industry and as well as gambling later on, as I've mentioned. He knows how to cross media. We can see how The Magical Entertainer is published by Ornams at 4 Duke Street, Delphi, right at the heart of London's West End. And Ornams also take out a full-page advert on the last page of The Wizard for the very latest magical novelties. It may be that, unlike many other trade professional magazines, but also like many others too, The Wizard didn't need to make a profit in itself because it was rather just a part of Selbit's construction of himself and promotion of himself on the stage of print as on the stage in a music hall or in a physical entertainment space. And in that sense, we might compare it, in fact, to the Swan Lane Gazette, which was the other very, very rare magazine that I've got on the BLT 19, which was also, in fact, a fake magazine. It wasn't a real one. It really was masquerading as a magazine. It really was entirely an advert for a company. Now, in best self-consciously humorous music hall manner, The Wizard even openly promotes itself as an advertising vehicle for entertainers. Here we go. The first column of gossip on the very first page of content makes fun of its own effects in getting an engagement for Malini, the card conjurer. We should like to think that our remarks assisted Malini to this engagement, it more or less says. Indeed, if we were certain that the manager regularly perused his Wizard, we might chance it and send in the artiste a bill for commission. Now, this is all terribly camp. It both supports and undermines its claims in the same way that Joad Heteb's gender identity was both supported and undermined, as we saw earlier. The wizard, and I'm obviously giving you a hugely compressed version here, the wizard doesn't just illustrate how to do magic tricks, the techniques of the stage labor, if you will, but it shows how much work success on the stage involves a lot of offstage work as well, creating and advertising oneself through various media forms. And this in turn suggests that the queer work of identity is and has been for a long time absolutely central to the capitalist entertainment system. I've mentioned this before, and I'm giving you a very specific kind of system here. It is seriously institutionalized. Now, to return to our original definitions, what I've done in this very brief paper is to be skeptical of existing gender categories in showing how it can be the norm to play with them. Now, that's all very well, but in this case, that work is founded on sexual injustice and pro-imperialist capitalist apology and racism. Fundamentally, it supports gender and racial categories by relying on the notion of confusing them as funny. What's less clear to me is the differentiation of advertising and content, fiction and fact here. These are not gender or racial categories so much as media categories or contracts with the reader. These are media categories which, because we're dealing with textual matter here, with written popular fictions rather than embodied lived life, seem to me to be larger categories than gender or racial ones in this particular instance. And that's precisely because we're dealing with textual artifacts. Can I make that absolutely clear? That may be controversial, I know, and I really welcome the opportunity to get your help in thinking that through. But my point is that far from a radical undermining of hegemonic beliefs and practices, such textual identity, apparently queer work, seems to me, yes, to open possible spaces for non-normative fictions of identity, but it also risks diverting the fictions of identity to other areas. Oh, blackface is just as much fun as sawing a woman in half or dressing up or as drag. Embarrassed by being mistaken for a woman? That question mark performs ambiguity, but my answer suggests otherwise, even while acknowledging its play and possibilities. What I'm trying to do here, as I've mentioned earlier, is to provoke caution and promote skepticism. Let's not be too hasty in celebrating queerness as inherently subversive. Queerness might simply replace previously normative categories. It might be a systematically distracting magical stage or textual illusion. We need to be aware of that and be careful. Thank you.